Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Yoga Well podcast. I'm your host, Chase Bossart. Joining me today is Melissa Shah, who is a longtime practitioner and teacher of yoga, a certified yoga therapist via the Yoga Well Institute training, and who does a lot of work in diversity and inclusion, specifically South Asian representation in yoga teaching. Melissa, so glad to have you.
So glad to be here. Thank you.
So I'd like to start just getting a sense of what was your introduction to yoga and how did you decide to be a yoga therapist, etc., like this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's so cool to think about how 7 years ago I started learning from and practicing with you, and now here we are on a fancy podcast website, which is awesome. And a little bit about just how yoga came to me. I grew up as a first generation Indian American. My parents immigrated to the US in 1985 and had my sister and myself, shortly after that. And my my learning around yoga happened at a really young age. I mean, my sister and I were probably practicing Ayurveda and yoga when we were younger. You just don't have language or name for it. It's just things you do in the house, and
Yeah, you get
I
oiled.
yeah, those
You
things like
take
and exactly. Your grandmother's like oiling your hair and then pulling it into a really tight braid, and every Indian person with long hair can, or South Asian person can definitely relate to that feeling. Um, and now we have a friend staying with us, and last night I offered to oil her hair, and now it's like my favorite thing to do for people I love. I'm like, let me just sit and like French braid your hair, just really get the oil in. And,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, that's
it's
absolutely love.
awesome.
It's awesome.
Yeah. Um, but I was diagnosed with asthma at the age of 2. I grew up in New York City, and that also led to lots of things people who grew up with asthma can relate to, like you're just getting sick really frequently, sinus congestion, respiratory infections. That's just sort of a part of your childhood, or it was a part of mine. And breath was something that was like not something that came easily to me, or was not something that, somebody who doesn't have asthma or respiratory condition, like you may never really think about your breath, right? It just sort of happens regardless of what you're doing. But at a really young age, that was something that I was always hyper aware of. Could I breathe? Could I not breathe? If I went to someone's house and they had a cat, what was I going to do? Do I have my nebulizer? Do I have my inhalers? There's these things that they just kind of become a part of your identity and how you move through life without realizing. It's just like, anyone who had any kind of, grew up with any kind of chronic illness. So my mom actually started teaching yoga right away, or when I was really young, as a way really to manage those symptoms. That was sort of my entry point. So I think it's interesting being a yoga therapist now. I think back to that was actually how I had always learned yoga, in a therapeutic context or with therapeutic application, which is just super cool.
That is super
And
cool.
then when I was a preteen, around that time, my mom, you know, as many preteens are, um, very indignant and refusing to say yes to things. And so my mom was like, you and your sister are probably not going to learn yoga if I teach you. So started going to a family friend's house after school a couple of days a week, and we just went to an adult hatha yoga class in our family friend's basement. There was no like kids yoga or let's play games or anything like that. It's like you're just gonna do the 2 hour class, and it was whatever it was. And that was really how I started to regularly, more formally practice in middle school. And then the journey kind of like took its own shape from there. Um, More so on the question about how I came to yoga therapy, it was sharing how that was really like at a really early stage of life, how I sort of entered practicing yoga. And I went through a whole journey like many other teachers in the US or in Western culture, where you do take like the 200-hour trainings, you do end up teaching like in a studio format setting, because for me, like that's at least what I told myself was no one's going to come to a class if I teach what I've been taught growing up. It's like too Indian or it's too traditional. It's not relatable, like all the things I would tell myself because I didn't really have the community I have today to like uplift me and uplift those things that I've learned in those parts of my identity. But when I started studying with Yoga Well and almost became like reintroduced to yoga therapy, that voice just kind of got stronger and stronger over the years of teaching in groups is really great and can be really useful in a lot of ways, but the transformation is really happening in those like one that deep work, like doing working with people one on one. And it took definitely like many years to have like the strength or the confidence to make that pivot, but over time that clarity just kind of got louder and louder until the one-on-one work started to kind of crowd out everything else. So that's where I am now.
I love it. It's so interesting. You know, it somehow yoga in North America has become synonymous with exercise
Yeah.
class. You know, and there's a bunch of people in there and they're pushed physically and you know, it's or the other possibility is that yoga is some kind of spiritual woo woo that's very far out that you have to be strange or you know interested in very esoteric things to find your way to, etc. And you know that is so it's it's disconnected from what seems to be the way that yoga has been handed down for thousands of generations, where you had a teacher and a student or a very small group of students, and the teacher knew each of them very well and is able to guide their development not only with practices but with tasks and chores and things that are around the house. You know, I mean, I always think of this model in Indian culture of going to live with the guru at
Yeah.
age somewhere between age 5 and 8 after you've done your string ceremony. You leave your parents, you go live with the guru, and then study with them. And what that gives you is somebody is seeing you all the time. There's
Yeah.
not any hiding. They know who you are. And you have to participate as part of the family. So you have chores and you have responsibilities and things you need to do. And the teacher can divide those according to what is the development that people need. So if someone, you know, if someone's very shy, and they need to be developing interactions with other people, the chore might be take the vegetables to market rather
Yeah.
than weed in the garden, because you know they have the person who is overly outgoing and who doesn't have enough introspection. You might have them weeding in the garden, and you have the other person who is is not comfortable interacting with other people. You may say, well, please go to take the vegetables to market, etc. So, you know, this level of observation of the personality and of the person's development, etc., is just not possible in a group class.
Yeah.
And then group class becomes like you know, just exercise that you do, and there's a whole transformational focus that is, I won't say it's missing in group classes. I mean, they have their role, etc., but it doesn't have the strength and the power that working one-on-one does.
Yeah. I agree. In a music school I've been studying since I was in high school in North Indian classical music. We have a very traditional like guru shishya parampara, or like guru student tradition. And sometimes in the summers during our like shibir or like week-long retreat, when we were doing it in person, I would go to my Guruji's house and like stay there and help out just where needed. And I remember so clearly the last time we had an in-person shibir 4 years ago, I was definitely making a lot of mistakes with like tasks I was supposed to be doing. And she just said, if you just observe me and if you just watch me, you will learn so much. You basically like, you don't have to write anything down. There's nothing like, it's not like there's like specific things you have to do. She's like, just watch. And that alone is a way of learning, and not just watching her teach music, right? Like making food in the kitchen, or um, doing things for our buddy Guruji or her Guruji, and just watching their relationship, like so much insight can come from that. And I see so many parallels with yoga too, right? When you think about what does it mean to actually do what Sri Krishnamacharya says, which like, teaches it applies to the person in front of you as the other. Like, what does that actually mean? And what I take from that is not only how to observe, but how to really hold space. And what does it really mean to hold space? And group settings can be so valuable because one function could be building community, which is so
Hmm.
important because
Yeah.
building a practice that, building a sustainable practice over time, like you need community, right? You need people who see you for who you are and support you. And what is also the function of having, your own personal practice that you're coming back to again and again every day, and how insight really can come from both.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt. Um, this piece that you're talking about, your singing teacher, you're telling you to just watch me. One of the most important definitions of yoga is this sangati. Right? It's from the Amara Kosha, where the sangati means it often gets translated as union, but it is, if you break the word down, it's like coming together completely, right? So
Yeah.
we can also say it's linking. So just having that connection with the person, something is transmitted, something is moving
Yeah.
from one teacher to the from one person to the other. And in a lot of ways, the most powerful way of learning is simply being present.
Yeah.
I this I know you're trained in Vedic chanting as well, and there's an idea in Vedic chanting where everything should be memorized, and traditionally what that has meant is huge amounts of chants are memorized, and as somebody who came to it late in life, it's like, oh my god, it's so much work for me to memorize anything, and how did this happen? And it if you're coming to it at a young age, and if you're doing it in a traditional way, you're memorizing 20 to 30 lines a day, and then the next day you get another 20 or 30, and the next day another 20 or 30. And how that happens is only possible through the development of a particular way of perceiving, of a particular mind
Yeah.
frame, right? And you have to be able to be completely present and open. And the teacher says the line, chants the line, then you repeat it twice. If there's some mistake or something that the teacher doesn't feel like it's quite correct yet, then the process repeats until you get it perfectly. Then they move to the next line, etc. So like there's a whole way that something comes in and is indelibly in you, and then is accessible to you
Yeah.
later, etc. That it's related to this idea here of just watch me, just see what I'm doing, and you'll learn so much. It's like there's something is transmitted, is something is passed on, and our Western educational models don't really have this as an
Yeah.
explicit thing, so far as I'm aware of, anyway. It's more that, well, get the information and put it down and be able to do it. It's like,
Yeah. That's so powerful. I
so
think the part you're saying about I think what I'm hearing too is this way of perceiving, it's a skill like anything else that takes not just time to nurture, but practice and like a willingness, I would say, good desire.
The willingness. That's exactly right. And the other thing that it really is required is the on the teacher's end is that they have those experiences and they know what it is like and they know how to get
Yeah,
there themselves and they're actually passing something on. It's
yeah,
not it's not a bunch of information.
yeah,
It's an experience that's being replicated in the other person.
yeah,
And this is very hard to articulate without the experience yourself. If you've had the experience yourself, then it's so clear. But if you haven't had it, then you look at these educational methods and you think like, what is going on here? This is not efficient. What we
yeah,
need is to get more people in the room,
yeah,
get
yeah,
more people
absolutely.
studying the information, etc.
Or
And
do or fit more
yeah,
things into one practice, right? Like fit more
yeah,
tools, fit more techniques into one class.
right, right. So it's so interesting that you had this arc where you had a pretty, I guess, classical or traditional or whatever word you want to use there of yoga studies. They were specifically for you and your health, and then you're doing these classes, small group classes with somebody who
Yeah,
can really give you a lot of individual attention, and they're long, so there's a lot of time in there to actually develop or to work on a particular topic or whatever it may be, etc. And then you go to turn around and share that, and you have a sort of crisis of confidence about like, oh,
yeah,
this won't fly.
yeah. That's crisis
I
of
think I
confidence is
need
a
to
really
go
great way
and
to put it.
I need to go have this. I'm gonna go get quote certified.
Yeah,
Air quotes. And
right.
I'm so frustrated with the Yoga Alliance because I think they're really oriented around monetary gain and 200 hours and 500 hours certifications. I mean, that was, what can you do in 200 hours? What can you do in 500 hours? It's like nothing. And somehow that makes people qualified to teach and all of that. It's very disappointing that the bar is so low. And, it's in contrast to the number of hours that you spent in middle school and high school and doing all of this stuff to become a competent yoga practitioner. And yeah, it's interesting.
Absolutely. I think the couple of things that are coming into mind when you mentioned Yoga Alliance is they like, other governing bodies, even in other modalities, like say like psychotherapy or yoga therapy, right? They're like all these kind of different governing bodies that in some ways like Yoga Alliance exists to create some standards, right? So that not just like
Mm-hmm.
anyone with any kind of training can just go out there. There have to be things that have to be covered. And I don't doubt that there can be some value in making sure that teachers are prepared, that all teachers who come out of a training are prepared to do XYZ. Like, I don't doubt that there's some value in that, but the reality of how it's actually being applied is just another way of yoga being able to be commercialized or commodified and then marketed in a really specific way so that there is no room for or I wouldn't say no, but there's a lot less room for the individual's experience and their journey in becoming a teacher. I think one of the things I take issue with around that, and this is of course being someone who also like has done Yoga Alliance certified trainings, has
Of
helped
course.
colleagues also like get their trainings accredited Yoga Alliance. So having been through this whole process as well, I think what another thing that's coming to mind that can feel really frustrating is I think a lot of teacher trainers who go through that Yoga Alliance process, and I know you have too, like also feel this way as well. Like as they're putting their training together, they're like, wait, I had this whole big amazing thing. And I'm like visualizing, I don't know, I guess I'm visualizing dough going through a pasta maker. It's like my dough is like this different shape and I've like put all these really great things in it and then it goes to the pasta maker and like comes out the same shape noodles like everything else. Even though you know the pasta's different. I'm sorry, today's like a metaphor day. I don't know. This is like my third metaphor I've had in a call today. I don't know. Like an hour ago, I was talking about snow globes. I'm not really sure as a representation for my life right now. So,
I can get into pasta making. Yeah, that sounds pretty good.
but I think there are more people than not that have developed these really incredible, thorough trainings and that also feel similarly, and I think this kind of comes maybe to like the next part of a conversation of then why are we all upholding it? If it's not just me and you that feel this way, there's many other people I've talked to that have their own trainings and studios and stuff that I think these governing bodies have they've actually created a whole industry in
Yeah,
which we
that's
are
right.
reliant on these really specific standards that aren't necessarily representative of like the vastness of something like video yoga. And with that, like there's an element of like gatekeeping, right? Like who is making these decisions? Like how many different people are they really going through? And I guess I just wonder, right? Like there's a piece of how did this happen in the first place, which there's so many potential answers to that, but there's also another piece of how are we all still upholding it? If so many of us know
Well,
this to be true, then, you
I
know,
mean, I just very honestly, from the perspective of Yoga Well Institute, like more people sign up for pieces of paper
100%. Yeah.
than they do for education.
Yeah.
So, um, we have ongoing subscription philosophy classes. They meet on Thursday nights. One is involving in the Yoga Sutras, and we take 6 years basically to go through the Yoga Sutras line by line, and that doesn't work to start at the beginning and then so it's just like join us where we are. We do all kinds of review, we do contextualization wherever, and then we speak about the particular sutra that we're in right now. And then so wherever you are in your yoga journey, you just start coming, and over time these things, the concepts repeat. Patanjali is not speaking about that many different topics. He's just presenting a few core things again and
Yeah.
again from different angles and at different depths. So, it'd be a little bit like if, I show you my pen. This is one angle, it's straight ahead, and then there's another angle where I'm pointing it at you, and another angle where the other end is pointing at you. And in order to understand pen fully, you have to go through all the different angles. So if you just show up in our philosophy classes on Thursday evenings and you hang in there over the course of several years, there will be incredible blossoming of the depth of understanding about like what is yoga. And it doesn't matter, are we in the first chapter, are we in the second chapter, third or fourth chapter, because wherever we are, we're going to be going back and forth and referencing all these other things and tying it into a huge thing. And people would rather sign up for a discrete course. Starts here, ends there. At the end, they're going to give me a piece of
Yeah.
paper. And that paper I can take to Yoga Alliance and be registered. And if you do like a training, almost without exception, people want to know who's certifying this. And the really kind of wonky thing is Yoga Alliance doesn't certify. Yoga
Yeah.
Alliance is only a registry, right? They're not actually saying that you are a certified yoga teacher. They're saying, well, this yoga course has gone through and passed our certification, requirements, and they're certifying you so you can register with us. And that is like the only game. Now, the International Alliance of Yoga Therapists is building and they're coming. And, there has been for the past few years a very strong distinction made both by Yoga Alliance and by the the International Association of Yoga Therapists, IAYT, that yoga and yoga therapy are different and they require different kinds of training, et cetera, et cetera. But even that has changed now. If you are a doctor, or if you have some sort of a psychotherapist, or if you have some kind of other licensure, and then you take like a 200-hour teacher training, you can start calling yourself a yoga therapist.
Yeah.
And to me, that's just like offensive, because yoga has its own anatomies. It has its own perspective on how the human system functions. And it's different from the anatomies and the views of what the physiology is from the Western allopathic medical model. So to say that, well, I'm trained in allopathic medicine and I have a 200-hour teacher training and that makes me a yoga therapist is just like, there's so much disregard for what yoga actually is and what is the history and the context of this teaching. I don't even know where to start. I'm just so disappointed in that kind of thing.
I think I mean I completely agree. And what's coming to mind with that is how easy it is for this culture that we live in, a Western culture, to do that with a culture they maybe see as like less than, right? Like Indian culture or something that is not Western culture, right? Like a non-European origin. And I just wonder if like yoga came from a white-centered country, like if the same thing would be happening, right? And we see this a lot with, all sorts of cultural appropriation in yoga, but just how easy or reflexive it is for people to like co-opt these practices, dilute them, and almost make them, like in this example you're giving, as if I can go to a 10-hour CEU and say, okay, well now I'm a mental health provider now, right? Or
right,
I guess, right? Like physicians go through, say, a whole internal medicine residency, and they want to do something that's specialized in this part of the body. They have to go through a multi-year fellowship, or at least a 1-year fellowship, right? And there's so much disregard for the potency of yoga practices, specifically yoga therapy. And some of that, I'm sure, comes from a lack of understanding, but I think some of that also comes from a lack of willingness to understand, knowing that there's just significantly, hopefully this is changing, but there has been significantly less accountability when it comes to taking things from a culture that's not yours, in Western culture. And for decades, no one has held any of these teachers or organizations or teacher trainings accountable for like the harm they are causing. And I do think a lot of that is changing, but I think there's so much left to go. So I think when you're sharing that about how some of that might be shifting around yoga therapy versus a yoga teacher certification, I think it just makes me really sad. Just feels like we're like swimming upstream in some ways.
We are swimming upstream. As you're talking, I'm just thinking about how, for me, the big problem in yoga teaching in North America or in the West is lack of context. So there's yoga as a teaching. What are the principles and what are the purposes and the aims and what are the fundamental foundational physiologies which it's working with? Those things are just poorly understood and really not known. So, if you, just as an example, yoga is starting with the idea that anything alive has a spirit aspect and a material aspect, so that, there is a soul or there is spirit, and it's in the physical container, and the physical container serves as a kind of link, as a kind of support, allowing allowing the spirit to operate on this plane. So the starting point is you are a spiritual being having a human experience,
Right.
right? But then you look at allopathic medicine, or so let's say Western. I listened for a period the past few years. I've been listening to a lot of physics podcasts. They're so interesting, and they're approaching many of the same philosophical problems and questions that yoga is approaching, but from a different perspective. So if you start with allopathic medicine or you start with physics or whatnot, what you're starting with is the physical facts are all the facts. So your body and your consciousness and the way your mind operates and all of that has to do with biology, chemistry, and something, so from the get-go, from the very beginning, there's some kind of difference. And people, because our credentialing is so limited, people show up for 200 hours, they become a teacher. In 200 hours, you don't have any time to teach any of the physical movements that most people think of as yoga, let alone the philosophical context or the purposes or aims or goals or very much about prana and how prana is the foundation of all movement in the system, etc. So we get people who are really steeped in a Western episteme showing up and looking at something which is developed and created and operating from a very different episteme, a very different knowledge basis foundation, and co-opting it and being like,
Yeah.
well, I can see I can see that what you're doing is you're bending forward and, you're moving your body, and I know what the body is, and I have a lot of anatomy and physiology studies and training, so I can understand what is happening there. And so I'm going to start teaching that. And it's like, no, wait. Where's prana?
Yeah.
Where's panchamaya? Where's pranavayus? Where's the tattvas? How are we thinking about any of this stuff? And it's just like, no, look, gonna bend over. I want you to hinge at the hips.
Yeah.
What do the hips have to do with that? Yoga is about the spine and about the breath. I mean, hips are important, sure, but forward bend, like to say that you hinge at the hips is just to lead with, I don't understand Indian anatomy. I don't even understand the foundation of what I'm doing here. So I'm going to project my own cultural foundations onto it, and I'm going to turn it into something that makes sense to me in my culture. But I'm still going to call it what you're calling it.
Right. And that's different. And I think that's really different from meeting someone where they are. Like those are two completely different things.
Yeah.
And I do think that this idea of meeting someone where they are gets used for a lot of things that's maybe not meant for, right? Meeting someone where they are, like applying the tools, like as the person can understand it in that moment, you can still do that and retain a lot of integrity and respect from the culture that you're drawing it from. And I think sometimes, like when I teach like non-South Asian, or I mean, not just non-South Asian students, but students in general who are wondering, how to really honor like the source culture. Like one thing I really share, like one thing they come to it with as, well, if I don't say all of these things, then I'm not honoring the culture. And it's like, it's not a checklist, right? And I can also see why, because so much of how we come into these spaces is by like wanting to be perfect, not wanting to get things wrong. And so when we come into it with that, it's hard to even meet ourselves where we are, right? So like, how can we expect ourselves to adapt the tools to meet someone where they are if we're coming into it already with, I can't get anything wrong, But I think so much gets, like what you're saying, it's like so much gets so much gets missed, like the function behind why you're doing what you're doing. Like, what is the point? Like, why do we even care about it? And this past weekend, I taught a 10-hour immersion for space holders, really not just yoga teachers, but could be mental health providers, like educators, anyone who's holding space for people where they're actively teaching about breath and wanting to just refine their tools and techniques. And this is really the center of what we talked about, which is you have, I gave them a few different models to focus on, but I also acknowledge there are also different models and lenses to look at prana and breath with. These are just a few, and then none of them are actually the same. So it's because you see similarities, it can be easy to say, well, if something is also Brahmana, that also means Pranavayu. If that's Pranavayu, that also means Anahata Chakra. It's like, well, they're actually three completely different models and ways of looking at it, but one might resonate with you more right now, so you might choose to course plan or sequence through one, but these are all different lenses on how to see something. But it's so easy to take that and apply it to Western anatomy or like lump them all together to try to make sense of something. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. And so many trainings like are not equipped to, and you don't have time to even unlearn, right? So it takes so much time to even do that, right? And then you're left with, okay, but now I have to make sure people get what they actually came here to get, which is how to teach a 60-minute class. And so I can also really feel for teachers who feel really who just feel kind of like stuck in the muck with that, right? Like not sure where to go. And I think conversations like this one are hopefully opening or encouraging teachers to like move further on that path of unlearning.
You know, while you're talking, I was just thinking about some decisions that we took at the Yoga Well Institute, which was we don't have a teacher training program now. We have a practitioner training. So if you do our practitioner training and you want to be a teacher, you can do some extra coursework. I think it's about 50 hours or something along those lines, that will then meet the criteria that Yoga Alliance has for being teacher certified, etc. So you could do that, and you can do this course, and then you can add on, and you get to become a teacher certified or whatever, which is our sort of workaround. But what we're really trying to emphasize is that, hey, look, yoga is a really deep way of being. It's a means of how you perceive the world and respond to it. And it's important that it's not some intellectual idea. It's important that it's in you. To be a good yoga teacher, in our opinion, it requires that you're first a good practitioner. You have to wrestle with the concepts. You have to actually work with the movements and the breathing and your attention. And you have to, and that takes time. So, I have to praise, I know a lot of people suffered immensely during the pandemic, etc. But the pandemic has changed our world in so many important ways. And for me, one of the things that happened is that it released me from workshops. I can go to some place and be with people for 3 days, for a week, whatever it is. And I can keep them interested and, in other words, I can keep them entertained, etc. And usually what happens is the concepts blow their mind. And at the end of the 3 days or a week or whatever it is, they're like, oh my God, thank you so much. Blah, blah, blah. And then I never see them again.
Mm-hmm.
Not interested. Sorry. Not interested. What I want to do is I want to work with people over long periods of time. So, our practitioner training is 1.5 years. I consider that short because what you were just saying about like the integration of things, how long does it take to unlearn? How long does it take to really become aware of what it is that your blind spot is? Or oh my word, you mean hinge at the hips is incorrect? Wait, but that's the way I've been doing it for the last 10 years. Okay, fine. Don't worry about it. Just listen. And that takes time. right? So I don't want to do a workshop. I mean, I still do some workshops and things like that because you need space where people can
Yeah.
interact with you and meet you and all of that. But I really just want to work with people over a long period of time because that support and that space holding through time is, in my opinion, really critical for changing patterns and for and transformation, etc. And without
Yeah.
it, it's very, very difficult.
I was saying what we were talking about too is really a
No, no,
cultural shift.
yeah,
And
say more.
I think the willingness to not only unlearn, but then once as you unlearn, to stay there and be there in the relationship with the teacher, with the space, and build new patterns and be willing to operate a different way, you always say. It's a slow process. And sometimes things happen quickly, right? Sometimes you have these aha moments where everything just blows wide open and you're like, I can't go back to what I was doing anymore now that I know this, right? But oftentimes it's slow relative to in our culture how we think about progress should happen, I would say. An example that, because of my positionality, social location, like it's not my place to like educate people unnecessarily, but an example would be with caste discrimination, which is caste is something that's a system that has been built over the course of thousands of years in South Asia, but it's very much prevalent across the whole world. And it's even more prevalent conversation now in yoga spaces, particularly with South Asian communities, because one, because it's important, but two, the majority of South Asian practitioners, Indian practitioners in the US have caste privilege, right? Because if you think about the immigration waves in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the people who were able to immigrate over, the majority of them already came from caste privilege families. So you already have like this bias toward people with caste privilege of Indian people and South Asian people in the US who are also learning to teach yoga. So then there's that. And there's a lot of work that incredible people are doing, like one of the founders of Equality Labs, and she recently wrote a book called Trauma of Caste, and more people are reading it, which is so awesome. And she just really not only talks about the urgency of this work, but how even as you're unlearning, just like in yoga, it's not a static step by step process. There are steps, but things are also, it's like so many models in yoga where things are also existing at the same time and influencing each other. And when you're unlearning, it's not like you just peel a layer and like everything is clear, right? It can like shake up your whole world, right? And nothing feels clear. And you need time for that to settle. And like you need the support from a teacher or a community that's holding space for you as you let those things settle and integrate so that you can take time to have clarity on, okay, what is the next action? What is the next thing to do? But I think a lot of times what I've seen yoga spaces is like, it's not only that there's a rush, but the rush is also mirroring how our society lives. And if we're just taking those same patterns and bringing them into how we're also doing yoga training, yoga spaces, then how is the conversation moving forward? I guess is what I'm thinking about. And so with caste discrimination, for example, I just went to a talk that a friend of mine, she brought in a professor and led a talk on her platform at Tejal Yoga. And one of the things the professor has shared was this system has been built and perpetuated over thousands of years. We're not going to dismantle it in 30 years. Like it's going to take generations. And that's also okay because we're moving forward in a process. And there's going to be so many different iterations and way that needs to shift, but it's just like our yoga practice. Like it's an evolving, living thing, and it has to change with us as we change. And one thing I notice a lot in this industry is like there's just a lot of unwillingness around that, right? And I think that's what makes it hard to have a 6-year Yoga Sutra learning program where you're like, just come and just be and let things marinate and let things settle and practice being present. It's so challenging to create a context for people to understand that because I think it goes against everything in which many of us have been taught how to learn.
It's such a good point.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a good point. What you're talking about, the caste privilege and whatnot as well. There's such a discussion in our Western yoga about what is the role of Indian teachers, right? And how is it that, do you
Yeah.
have to be Indian to teach yoga, right? And, I'm a white man, and
Hmm.
if I look at all the things, I check all the boxes. I am white, I am straight, I am male, I am the owner of the institute, I am the main teacher. It's
Yep.
like check, 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 check. All the power privilege positions are there. And am I even qualified to be sharing like yoga or whatnot? And if I do, am I able? Do I have to put qualifiers out there that that label all the things I am or thinking? And what are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, I think I think one of the things that come to mind is knowing when, and this is not just for you, right? For anyone, and myself included, because though I am South Asian, I am like cis presenting for sure, and my family is Jain, but also has caste privilege, right? Because Jains see themselves, many Jains see themselves as like in the upper caste in Indian society. So there's a lot of privilege there as well. Um, Also being like a medium to lighter skin Indian versus a darker skin. So I just want to like illustrate that South Asians are still like incredibly underrepresented in yoga spaces, definitely in
Mm-hmm.
yoga therapy in the West, and it's also complicated, right? There's other layers of privilege. But something that comes to mind with that is when there is opportunity to, and when there's opportunity to do this, like, are you willing to give up your seat of power? So meaning like I think with people who have like more privilege in dominant cultures, like being white or cis or straight, a man, things that come to mind are who else is teaching alongside you, right? If you're teaching a training, who is like represented on that faculty, and those things really really matter because when people like want to come to yoga therapy trainings or yoga trainings, and they historically have not seen themselves represented in those spaces in like the yoga industry. I don't think people who have more privilege realize like the amount of effort and labor that takes into not only being in that space underrepresented, investing money and time in a space where like your identities are like not seen or acknowledged, right? There's so much like
Mm-hmm.
unsaid or unseen labor and effort, emotional effort that goes with it that can't really be articulated. And so seeing students be able to see themselves represented in faculty is so important. And so one thing that comes with that is being able to give up the seat of power, like when the time calls for it. So sometimes for me, that could be, you know, getting an opportunity and knowing that there's someone, not necessarily better qualified, but like that is also underrepresented and is just as qualified, like maybe more, and maybe might not get the opportunity otherwise, right? Like passing on the opportunity to somewhere else. I don't think that happens enough in in yoga spaces, and that is another conversation for a different time about like white supremacy culture and like competition and very much like binary, right? It's either if it's not mine, it's never going to come back, right? And there's like a scarcity thinking to that. And that's not what I'm saying is like the conversation we're having, but those are some of my thoughts around like when a person does have more power and is also the leader of an organization, there's so much responsibility that comes with who else am I creating opportunity for? And if I see like a pretty homogenous representation in the people I'm bringing into a training or into workshops, why is that? Because we all have blind spots, all of us. They're just different, right, for different people. And so what is at the root of that? Sometimes what I see in other trainings that are white led or have seen in the past, and the language that they've used is there's like an unsaid bias around people of color who are also yoga teachers who like there's some unsaid bias around them being not as qualified, right? Or there's something about their perception around like teachers who aren't white not necessarily looking the part or being the part or having as many credentials. That's something I've seen before. So there's just a few things that come to mind, but
It's
there's
very
so much
interesting.
more there that can be said in 10
Oh,
minutes,
it's
so
a huge,
um
yeah,
yeah.
it's such a huge topic. You know, I tell you, the last few years has obviously been a resurgence of interest in this in the U.S. and North American culture as a whole.
Hmm.
And in the last year or so, not quite year, maybe 9 months or so, myself and all the faculty of the current yoga teacher training, the yoga therapist training that we're teaching right now, have been doing the being mindful of race curriculum, which is bmor.us, and it, it's awesome. It's so good. So um, the format is there's a series of meetings that you have, and we've been meeting every 2 or 3 weeks, and you have to watch some videos and do some reading beforehand, and then you make a commitment to be there every time you meet, and um, it's all about understanding your own privilege and understanding the sort of institutionalized mechanics of our culture that are creating and upholding these privileges.
Yep.
And, you know, of course, we probably each of us all thinks that we know all of this stuff already and whatever. And I certainly thought that going in, but oh my God, has my
Yeah.
mind been blown, and in just fantastic ways. And the material in the course has been fantastic. It's very challenging. It really forces you to consider, like, well, how is it that I'm in this position, and what is it, these things that you're talking about, if you're not a part of the dominant group, then how much effort and difficulty is required to actually just be present in
Yeah.
somebody else's dominant culture, and to be safe and to be seen and to be truly appreciated for who you are, etc. All of these things, so much effort is there. And to really address this is not something that the dominant culture can ask those without privilege to call to their attention and highlight, etc. It's actually that, no, the people who are in the privileged position have to do a lot of work, and it's
Yeah.
it's not, a lot of it is unpleasant work, acknowledging your own blind spots and the ways that you have fallen short, and etc. And but this the piece that's on my mind right now is that there was a very interesting podcast in On Being with Krista Tippett, where Robin DiAngelo and Resma
Hmm.
Menakem had a conversation. And Robin DiAngelo is the one who wrote White Fragility, and
Hmm.
it's just like there's so much about, like, hey, dominant person, you gotta do your work for like 3 years or 5 years or 10
Yeah.
years, and then let's talk. But if
Yeah.
you come to me now, like, the likelihood that what you're going to say is going to cause me more harm and
Yeah.
going to cause me even more difficulties. Um, I think that there's a real responsibility for those of us who are in the yoga world, which is, a Indian knowledge system. It's a Indian wisdom system that we have to be doing our own work around well, what biases am I bringing to this?
Yeah.
And what do I need to be highlighting, or what do I need to be doing in order to not just say everybody's invited?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
everybody's invited doesn't mean SHIT if it's all that dominant culture. You get there, and what have you done to actually make other people comfortable in the space, etc.
Exactly.
And this is work that the creators of the space, the owners of the institutes, the teachers who are that it's work that we have to do on our own, actually, before going into um, or before being able to really be a trustworthy partner in some kind of dialogue. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
feel like people are beginning to wake up to that, but we still have a long, long, long ways to go to even have the kind of work and the introspection and the self honesty that's required to be, to I don't think a lot of people are really aware that that's what's required to
Yeah.
enter into this discussion around privilege and race and identity, etc. In these healing spaces.
And I think thank you so much for sharing that, because I think one thing I'm really hearing from what you shared is like just like with your like with the yoga practice, right? It's this I'm referencing this immersion again I taught this weekend, and a big conversation around it was the information is just that. It's information, it's tools, but the experience, like, you always would teach us in our like yoga therapist training, the experience is the most important thing. And so you can have like intended energetic effects, and you can have which values you want to focus on, or, tools and techniques, but ultimately the person's experience, that is the most valid thing, because you can come in with a sense of direction and intention, and everyone's going to have a different response. And with the same thing you're talking about with like unlearning and like relearning, it's not just something like you can learn, right? That's like the first part. It's like something you really have to be, and it takes so much time, and there's going to be so many iterations of it, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because the willingness and the direction is there. And I just wish more people in like white center yoga spaces in particular, like really would take time to understand that, because if you utilize your practice as a place for you to explore and learn this, like you'll realize that there's so much possibility there that you may already have access to, of moving away from perfectionism, which then is also a movement away from white supremacy and dominant culture, right? And moving into that gray area of like, maybe there's not always one clear answer. Maybe there are many possible answers. And there are multiple directions I can take, and all of them might be beneficial in one way, but maybe there's one right now that feels clear. Or maybe this particular direction I have more supports. Like that's what I'm going to take. And I mean, I'm saying all these things knowing that even for myself, it's like really hard to be in that liminal space, because that's actively a move against all the ways in which many of us grew up. But that I do really believe like that's how things are really going to change. The more of us that are willing to like move out of the black and white and the binary, the more possibility there is for the unlearning to really happen, because it's so freaking uncomfortable when it's happening, right? And the willingness for things to take their time in a world right now where there is so much urgency, but there also needs to be a sense of longevity in the practice, whether it's your yoga practice or anti-racism or anti-caste or anti-transphobia, or again, like anti-transphobia, like it's also like a longevity practice too, of like creating these new patterns for the next generation to be able to benefit from. So that's why, like, when you're talking about like, leading yoga spaces, right? Or like leading yoga trainings, at a minimum starting point, there has to be representation, because having the representation is not the only solution, but it's a movement toward not just more diversity in who decides to learn there and take the trainings, but it also is representative of something bigger, that like I am willing to share the seed of power, I'm willing to give it up, I'm willing to pass it on. And I'm willing to look at the biases that lead to me only maybe having white people come in and teach workshops in this training, or only white people to come in and co-teach these trainings, right? Like whoever this might be. And I don't know that people who like, especially white people who benefit the most from like dominant culture, I don't know that enough white yoga teachers really understand the power of that because they never have to, right? If like the
That's
color
the
of
whole
your skin
point
is
of
always
privilege.
exactly, but it's like I think this is Ijeoma Oluo, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. Her book, So You Want to Talk About Race. One of the chapters, she's talking about like what is privilege, and it's such a great read because she gives all these really practical examples of as you're reading it, right? Like you just can really feel like, yeah, this makes sense and this makes sense and this makes sense. And she gives an example of don't think about it as something being taken away from you. And that's something I've seen a lot, like teaching about these topics in training settings, the fragility, right? Where you feel like someone's taking a piece of my pizza and I'm never going to get it back. It's like, it's not a pie of pizza, it's not like everyone's only allowed one slice. You, Majority of spaces are still going to center you no matter what. So what is the real fragility there about like sharing that space or allowing people of color or trans people or people who have faced caste oppression? What is the issue or the problem with giving space for them to also create their own affinity spaces or demanding that there is more representation in the spaces they learn from? Because nothing is actually being taken away from you. And I think that's like, of course, the fragility piece, but she gives that example of it's not feeling guilty or bad about all these privileges that you have that you didn't necessarily earn, right? They're just there. It's the absence of having to feel hypervigilant or unsafe or not represented. It's an absence
Yeah.
of feeling something. And I think of that with
Yeah, which
that definition of Shanti, right? It's like what does the absence of obstacle feel like? It feels like one of the feelings could be peace, right?
yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to share that. Yeah.
Well, as a privileged person, you just don't understand all of those absences
Right.
because you don't feel them,
Right.
so they're absent, so you don't feel them. And to actually start to see that is, I think, really core to
Yeah.
this process that we're talking to. And I just want to tie this all up by saying, this is yoga, right? Yoga is a game about being. It's working on transforming the way you are in the world. And the pieces that are there are perceptual. How do you see what's happening? And how do you understand that? And that is so fundamental to each and every one of us that very often we don't really have much awareness that what we're seeing is highly prejudiced or highly structured by our previous experiences. And yoga is really getting us to wake up to that, right? And then yoga is also interested in identity. Who am I? Is the main question. And am I, for me, am I a white, straight, male business owner, yoga teacher, etc.? Like, is that, or, where am I operating from? And in these topics of perception and identity and
Yeah.
relationship, and they're really core to what yoga is. And yoga is this methodology where we have tools to come into awareness of that and then modify that, and then to really learn to operate not as that, or to be in a different way. And that takes time. It takes time. But I feel like that it's really that, all of these things that we're talking about today with race and privilege, etc., is, fits into the yoga conversation so well, so if people will just be open and
Yeah.
attempt to try, you know. So, Melissa, thank you so much for being on our podcast. It's so wonderful to have you, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. Just a reminder to people that they can find you at findyourbreath.net. Findyourbreath.net. Melissa Shah, thank you so much for being on.
Thanks, Chase. This has been truly special. I appreciate the conversation.
I hope we'll do it again soon. Thank you.
Definitely. Yeah.